Before we dive into the nitty-gritty and unleash all of our charts, I'd just like to let you know about a few of the upcoming events and initiatives we have going on at the centre while we have a captive audience. Oops. So firstly, hot off the press, we have our 2017 annual report, which is available outside today. You can also grab a copy off our website if you prefer it in soft copy. So do have a look what we got up to. This week we've also just confirmed the date and the speaker for our 2018 Mitchell Oration. It's the 6th in our annual series. So Sir Richard Feacham will be speaking on the topic of re-engineering the aid industry, a priority for the 21st century, on Thursday, 28th of June. So do save the date and we'll have more details online. Speaking of flagship events, we have also set the dates for the 2019 Australasian Aid Conference, even though it feels like it just happened. And we'll be issuing a call for papers and for panels soon. We'll also be taking sponsors again this year, so if you are interested in coming on board, do get in touch with me and we can discuss the options. We're also embarking on our next series of aid profiles, which will form the shortlist for the 2019 Mitchell Humanitarian Award, which we'll be presenting at the aid conference next year. You can see our past nominees up here on the screen, and we'd encourage you to read their stories if you haven't already. But if you do know someone whose story deserves to be told as part of this series, please do get in touch with us because we'd love to hear from you. We're also about to embark on our next Australian Aid Stakeholder Survey, so we'll have information coming out on that soon. We really value your participation in this and it provides really useful information on the state of the sector, so do keep an eye out when we launch the various phases of the survey. Also, we have 2 great P&G related events coming up this month. Next week, we've got the screening of the P&G made film Aliko and Ambai and a Q&A with the assistant producer, Teresa Mecki. And on May 30, we have a P&G evaluation forum discussing 3 recent P&G aid evaluations. So, I'm about to free you from this barrage of announcements, but before I hand over to Stephen, I did just want to say that when it comes to the type of work that you see today, our analysis on Australian aid, we do need to maintain independence, so we can be as frank as we need to be. So we are asking that if you do support the work that we do and are able to, if you could please consider making a donation. We try not to ask often, but we do need financial support. So we're asking you now, and we're very grateful to anyone who feels compelled to maybe chip in just a little bit to help us continue the work that we do on Australian aid. But now it's time to move on to the main show, which is what everyone's here for. This year we've changed the format up a bit, and we've decided to broaden the scope beyond the budget and share some of our wider analysis with you. So now I'm going to hand over to our Centre Director, Stephen House, who will give you the lowdown on the aid budget and much, much more. Please welcome Stephen.
All right, thanks a lot, Ashley, and good morning, everyone. As Ashley mentioned, we felt, the format, while useful, had perhaps got a little stale. The aid budget's become a little bit predictable. And so we have broadened out this event to give a wider review. So the cost for that is you have to put up with a lecture from me. I've got lots of slides and we'll see how far we get through. But let's dive straight into it. This is what I'm going to talk about, and then if we have time I'm going to talk go beyond the official aid program and beyond Australia to look at the other partners in the international scene. Let's start first with the budget that was handed down last night and the broader budget context. So I think it's fair to say that public policy has been dominated by the deficit that came into being at the time of the Great Financial Crisis. But that problem is now shrinking. And while it's always been projected to shrink, the difference this year is these are actuals or estimates. It actually has shrunk already, and it's already gone away. And in fact, the budget is meant to return to a small surplus next year. So that's on the back largely of increases in revenue. and revenue has already started to rebound and is projected to continue. That in turn is on the back of improved commodity prices and stronger than expected employment growth. It may all go wrong again and these rosy projections not come to fruition, but even if it does, the deficit I think is already so small that that whole narrative of debt and deficit that had already pretty much faded away, I think has now been almost obliterated. While the deficit elimination is driven by strong revenue performance, it's important to note that's in the context of strong expenditure growth. So this is not a deficit problem that's been addressed by austerity. Indeed, if you were to look at this graph and try and work out how Australia solved its deficit problem, you would say, well, revenue fell away at the time of the financial crisis and took a while for it to catch up, and expenditure growth, expenditures has kept on growing, and that's not a bad simplification of the underlying, much more complex reality. All right, that's the overall budgetary context within which the aid budget is positioned. And normally we dive straight into the aid budget numbers, but this year there was a slight complication because we had some retrospective adjustments, and we need to understand those in order, well, first of all, they're important in themselves, but also in order to be able to understand the budget numbers, you've got to understand what are now the historical numbers. So you can see for the last 3 years, there are some fairly significant aid increases of, some almost 200 million for each of the 3 years. So what explains this fit of retrospective generosity? It's really the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Australia joined the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015, and the price tag for that was 930 million over 5 years starting in 2016. At the time, we wrote in blogs and in submissions, we commented on the price tag, which seemed to us fairly high, but we also said that it would be ODA eligible. Treasury and DFAT took another position that Australia's paid-in capital will not be provided from the aid budget. In the end, it turns out we were right, or at least 85% right, because 85% of it is being charged to the aid budget. It's only been officially confirmed by DAC recently. That's the government's rationale for taking this somewhat confusing approach. I think you could have taken a much more transparent approach. It was always obvious from the start it would be ODA eligible. The good news is that this sort of approach has meant that the AIB cost has come on top of the existing aid budget, because you can't have retrospective aid cuts. So I guess if you look at it from an aid budget, protecting the aid budget point of view, it's a strategy that has worked. But that explains the need for the retrospective adjustments, as well as 2 more are needed, right? We've had 3, we need 2 more. So with that context, you can now understand what actually happened in the budget. Of course, there were all these rumours and denials of cuts, but if we actually look at what happened, it's fairly simple. You can make a fairly simple comparison with what happened, what was put in the forward estimates last year. So this year and next is increased by about 160 to 170 each year to pay for the AIB. Then on top of that, this year and the next 2, so what were the 3 forward estimates years, are otherwise reduced by $10 million. It's a small amount, but somehow this government can't resist just taking out these small amounts from the aid program. And then what was a 2-year freeze to be followed by a resumption of CPI indexation has now been extended by a 3rd year. So the nominal aid freeze is extended to the new forward estimates year of 21-22. It's now, according to the budget papers, to be lifted the following year. So outside the forward estimates, and we'll see whether that happens. So this is the new aid trajectory under the coalition, just in nominal terms, slightly different to the old. The red is the last year of the Labor government. That's also been adjusted for reasons I haven't quite got to the bottom of yet, maybe to do with refugee costs. So in fact, we see a slight increase now in the first 2 years of the coalition, but then we see the cuts, and you end up pretty much where we were before. So some micro level changes, but if you look at the big picture, it's pretty much unchanged. We've always said that the coalition is cutting aid by a third once you take account inflation, and the number now comes out at 32%, right, which is this number here. So slightly lower base because of the reduction in that last year of labour, but then an additional year of the cuts. So the final position is almost unchanged. And if we put that, into the longer term historical perspective, this is the graph we've shown before. We've now extended it by another 10 years back to the 60s, but you see a period of gradual increase, the massive scale up, and then the significant reversal of the scale up. I'd say that the difference is that we used to think that there was kind of a reversal of the scale up, and then aid will continue, go back on a trajectory of slow increases. That seems like a little optimistic. Now, we still have an aid budget, kind of in free fall. It's maybe the fall is slightly less steep, but it's still heading south. And I guess that's the question, how long will the aid program continue to fall? We can't be as sanguine that we're back on a stable or increasing trajectory after a series of cuts. In fact, we are still in the midst of those cuts to aid. This is, if you look at it on a year-on-year basis and adjust for inflation, we're in a sea of red. Right? These are the ongoing aid cuts. And in fact, there are 8 of these. That's what we blogged about last night. We were just struck that, they're now, we've got 8 years of aid cuts in a row, some, much bigger than others, but nevertheless 8 in a row. And, we've never seen anything like it before, either in terms of magnitude of the cuts or in terms of the number of cuts. Most governments cut aid for a couple of years, 1 or 2 years when they're facing a difficult time, but this government has just kept on cutting. And if we look at the implications of that for generosity, this ODA to GNI ratio, it's at an all-time low and falling. I guess that hasn't changed. But that 0.2, we were already at a record low. The 0.2 sort of threshold is now just a couple of years away. We're going to hit that in 2020 and continue falling. I want to put this now in the international context. It's a fairly gloomy picture, and it's important to realise this is not symptomatic of some broader international malaise when it comes to aid. It's all too easy to think, that aid is something old-fashioned and the whole world is moving on from it. No, the whole world, well, we can't say the whole world, but in general, the world is embracing aid. Aid is at a record high and has continued to increase, and indeed increase strongly. There's a slight reduction in this very last year, but overall the trend is strongly positive. And that is reflected in the global ODA to GNI index. There are 2 ways to calculate that index. One is weighted and one is unweighted. The weighted is the total, the unweighted is the average. And if you weight it, right, you do see this sort of long-term decline. It has now stabilised. In fact, even that one's picked up. And that really reflects the US, right? The story of aid is the US is the blue, right? The US started big and has basically stayed the same. The rest of the world started small. The rest of the OECD started small and has increased. So you see this early decline in the blue line, the weighted average, but that's stabilised. And for the orange line, it's actually, almost at a record high. You can also see it this way. If you think of that 0.7 target, very easy to think that that target's out of date. It's totally irrelevant. But in fact, if you look at the number of countries that are achieving the 0.7 target, it's the blue. Again, it's at a record high. There are 4 of them this year, and there are a couple just below the 0.7, right? So, and the orange shows 0.5 to 0.7, and a 0.5 was a target Australia once aspired to achieve. And again, there are another 3 or 4 countries at that level. So yeah, I just want to underline that point that what we're seeing in Australia is not symptomatic of a broader, the rest of the world's going in a different direction. And the cynic might say, well, this is all about paying the cost of in-country refugee processing and entry, but it's not. That is one factor, and it is ODA eligible, the first year of in-country refugee-related expenditure. And, you know, it's a very legitimate and productive use of development assistance. But it's relatively small. It has increased, which is, it's the blue. But even if you take out the blue, you don't agree with that, you just look at the red, you'll still see strong growth in development assistance. So if you put those two conflicting trends together, the rest of the world becoming more generous, Australia becoming less, of course it's not surprising that our global ranking is plummeting. We're now, well, this one doesn't show the ranking, this just compares the ratios. You know, we're now, we never got to the unweighted average. We got close when we were scaling up, but we're now below even the weighted average, and significantly below by more than we've ever been. And that's because, you know, the two are going in different directions, right? We're getting richer. You know, as a country, we're becoming more prosperous. That's the blue line. But as a nation, we're becoming less generous. That's the green line. And, you know, just to drive this point home, you can rank Australia by our prosperity and by our generosity. And in terms of prosperity, that's the affluence, what I call the affluence rank, the orange line. So we're here, we're ninth. We're the ninth most affluent OECD country. But in terms of our generosity, here's our ranking. We're now the 19th most generous. So the difference between those two, you know, what I call the generosity deficit, so 19 minus 9 is 10. So our generosity deficit has never been higher than it is currently. And as I mentioned, in a couple of years, we're going to be joining the 0.2% club, which is the group of OECD donors who give 0.2% or less in aid, and it's not really a club you want to be a member of. The US is a member of that club, and, you know, if we were the largest aid donor in the world, perhaps you might think, okay, well, it's not so, you know, that's a compensating factor, but we're not the largest donor in the world. And the other members of that club have a per capita income much lower than us, at least 10,000 lower. And they're either former aid recipients, like Korea or Greece, or they're coming out of a severe economic and fiscal crisis, Spain, Portugal, Greece, or they are, you know, economies in transition, new joinees of the OECD. But this is the club we're going to be joining in just a couple of years. So why have we decided to buck the global trend and be so savage with our aid budget? As you all know, the old rationale for aid cuts has been the debt and the deficit, and this has been reflected in Julie Bishop's comments and was picked up by the DAC review in its remarks, in its review of the aid program. But this rationale, you know, doesn't really make a lot of sense, because, as I mentioned, the fiscal position is improving. You know, we should have seen some respite for aid if that really was the rationale. And as you can see from this graph, you know, and as I mentioned, consistent with what I mentioned before, non-aid growth has actually been growing pretty strongly, right? It's 31% under the coalition, adjusted for inflation, and here's that 32% cut for aid. So it's not really fiscal austerity, it's more that aid is simply much further down the priority list. And if you look at the spending on ODA to total expenditure, you know, it's been on a downward trajectory throughout the coalition period, and it's now down at well under 1%, well under 1 cent in the dollar. And I just particularly want to focus on the defence aid comparison. Some of you will remember in the days when aid was being scaled up, there was a lot of criticism that aid was being scaled up at the neglect of defence, and that this was, you know, very bad from a national security point of view. Well, that's certainly no longer the case, and in fact, it's quite remarkable that the ratio of defence spending to aid spending has already increased by such a large extent, from about $5, for every $1 of aid, $5 of defence. It's already gone up to about 8, and over the forward estimates, it's going to go up to $11 of defence for every $1 of aid, higher than it's ever been including during the Cold War. And given that Australia doesn't actually face any military threats, you really question the efficiency or effectiveness of this type of government decision making. I think it'd be very hard to justify this high level of defence spending. But anyway, all that stuff on fiscal austerity seems to be on the back burner. There's now a new rationale for cutting aid, which is the lack of public support. And if you've listened to recent speeches, or you can see this YouTube interview with the Minister for International Development, you'll see she very much casts the aid budget in terms of lack of public support rather than the fiscal position. So just to run through some of what she's been saying in explaining why the aid is so low. 80% of Australians think we're spending just enough or too much on ODA. And she's been citing Lowy polling on this, and sure enough, Lowy polling does show that about 80% are in the too much or about right category. Of course, it doesn't explain why you cut aid, because if you want to follow public opinion, you've also got a majority here who wouldn't support cutting aid. But that's the first point she's been making. The second one, drawing on some research that we've done, and Terence Wood in particular, 80% of the development sector believe we should spend more on ODA, but only 10% of regular Australians think the same. So yes, welcome to all the irregular Australians who might be here, and indeed non-Australians. But that's also, roughly true. Here you see the big difference between those in the polled in the development sector and the general community. I think where the Minister goes wrong is to get, in terms of her response to this and what she's going to do to build public support. She says the only way Australians will have confidence in the aid program is to understand that it will have a direct benefit to Australia. Whereas in fact, Terence has polled Australians on precisely this point, and you can see that only 4% think that are going to be motivated by the argument that aid has direct benefits to Australia. The great majority are more persuaded by arguments around it being a moral obligation or around enlightened national interests. So as a strategy to build public support, it doesn't seem to have a lot going for it. Where are the glimmers of hope that these aid cuts will at some point come to an end under the current government? We'll talk about Labor policy later. It's hard to be hopeful, but I guess the China factor is one that is certainly bolstering aid in the Pacific and may have a broader effect. And then the whole loss of international influence status hasn't seemed to have had worked so far, but when we are actually going to join this 0.2% club, it may swing into action. But overall, a fairly bleak outlook. All right, moving on from the overall aid quantities to what was in the budget in terms of allocations and initiatives. Let's look at countries and sectors. I think this was a budget for the Pacific. This is the AUSAID DFAT allocations, which are not as comprehensive as the total aid flows, but do kind of reveal government intentions. And you can see that over the coalition period, the Pacific has largely been protected. And in this budget in particular, the Pacific receives a boost in its aid allocation and is the only region to do so. East Asia, has had cuts and then has now had further cuts in its aid, and other regions are pretty much constant. So this is a budget that was, consistent with earlier government priorities, but which takes them further in terms of prioritising the Pacific over East Asia and the rest of the world. And we'll come to the initiatives behind that next. In terms of sectors, you can also say this is a budget that's consistent with broader policies and continues earlier trends. These are my estimates of where the various budgets with the adjustments for the AIB have come out. And you can see that infrastructure continues to increase, agriculture continues to increase, governance is steady, and education and health are cut once again. think this is consistent with the government's policy. It's got an aid for trade target. I think perhaps what's surprising is the government, has overachieved that aid for trade target. It's now 23%. Where, you had thought perhaps there was a rebalancing with the health security initiative, that there was going to be some stop to those, especially the cuts to health, given that you've got a flagship initiative on health security. But I guess, this is a ship that takes a long time to turn around, and priority is firmly set on aid for trade, so infrastructure and agriculture continue to grow at the expense of the other sectors. I'm going to skip this. Humanitarian funding is increased. That's part of the white paper announcement. I've just put in a question mark there because it was meant to increase last year and didn't actually. And it'd just be worth finding out a bit more about that. Perhaps there weren't the rapid onset disasters to exhaust the money allocated last year. At the same time, you'd think there's so many chronic crises that if you have it's hard to believe how your humanitarian allocation could be underutilised. So I guess there's a promise to increase the humanitarian allocation, but on last year's experience, you couldn't say that that promise will necessarily be delivered on. Looking more at other aspects of the aid program, it's just interesting to think of other government departments. It used to be a big part of aid, really not anymore, apart from ACIAR, which continues to grow. You see other government departments exiting development. I've taken out the AIB allocations which go through Treasury because we're really interested here in, actual departmental participation, through sending advisors and twinning programs and so on. Doesn't seem, certainly no longer a priority. Right, that's broadly on the allocations. Just some of the major initiatives underlying those numbers. So the underwater cable to Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. This is probably the biggest initiative in the budget. It had already been announced, but for the first time there are allocations. It's still unclear what the allocation is, and the government says it's because it's being tendered out, so it's commercial in confidence. But there was a newspaper report that was 200 million. And if you look at the actual increase to Solomon Islands and PNG, which is driving the increase to the Pacific, it's an increase of 100 million. And so that kind of makes sense. It's a pretty quick project. I think it only take 2 years to lay the cable. So 200 million. Of course, we were told not to conclude anything from the increase in PNG and Solomons, but if you do make that calculation, it all seems to add up. This is funded by cuts to Indonesia, 30 million. I guess Indonesia is singled out as the largest aid program outside of the Pacific and so vulnerable to aid graduation talk. And then basically the rest of the program is held flat in nominal terms, so it's cut in real terms, and then there is a small nominal increase in this budget, almost in line with inflation, which then funds the underwater cable. Of course, there are lots of debates about the cable, whether it should be part of the aid program or not. We can debate those, but I think regardless of that, there are certainly big issues around co-financing, which is expected from the governments. These governments are both in fiscal stress. PNG struggles to pay its salaries. It's not clear how they'll get the money for their co-financing contribution. And then how the cable will be governed, what the open access arrangements will be, are also unclear. And I can anticipate these two problems being quite thorny going forward. Second big initiative is health security. This wasn't a budget initiative, but it was announced late last year, and it certainly features in the budget. This is a very large program. It's equal in size to the 8th largest bilateral program. They've just announced PDP funding, which is medical for global medical research, which continues on and increases, what's now become an established pattern or established program of support from the Australian aid program. That's very welcome, I think. And yeah, just to say we continue to support this initiative, but to make the case for a separate international health research organisation or to broaden ACIAR's mandate. And then finally, I thought, what was really positive in the budget was the emphasis on labour mobility. You also see this in the numbers. There's, apart from the PNG and Solomon Islands increase, there's an increase in Pacific Regional. That's for a number of regional initiatives. There's also a Pacific Security College. There's a schools twinning program, but there's also support for both the APTC for training with a specific mandate to train for international markets and the Pacific Labour Facility. Yeah, I think this is terrific. It's the biggest dividend from the DFAT AusAid integration. You know, I think in the old days, DFAT saw the Pacific as AusAid's responsibility, and AusAid saw the Pacific through an aid lens. Now they're together, and DFAT's rather sceptical of what aid can achieve. You've had this confluence of promotion of labour mobility, with the government, you know, expanding the seasonal worker program, introducing the Pacific Labour Scheme, expansion of labour mobility, but then now the mobilisation of the aid program to support labour mobility. So, you know, what we call aid for migration as against aid for trade. And it is delivering serious money to the Pacific direct to households. So if you believe in cash transfers, you'll like what this is doing. This is just from the World Bank report. If you compare the income that workers are bringing home from the seasonal worker program with the money their governments are getting through the aid program, in Tonga it's the same, right? In Vanuatu it's still a long way to go, but Vanuatu is, participation is growing rapidly. And you know, this is direct to households, right? Doesn't have all the waste of aid programs. And you know, this is also in fact a benefit to Australia. I mean, the aid program, however much we might like it, it is a cost. Whereas this SWP income comes actually at a benefit to the Australian economy. Okay, moving on to aid performance. You know, do feel free to interrupt. I know I'm just rabbiting on. Government also just released last week the new aid performance report, Performance of Australian Aid 2016-17, which has a whole a raft of information around various performance aspects of the program. I won't summarise it for you, except to say that nearly all the performance benchmarks, all the 10 are either achieved or very nearly achieved. We'll just share with you a little bit of the analysis that we've done. We do this every year. Each country is ranked for performance against program objectives and whether they're on track to achieve the objectives. And this is the data for the last 4 years. And, you know, I just want to point out how unusual it is to get a rating of less than 50%, and how, if you do get a rating of less than 50%, you invariably bounce back the next year. So kind of the message is sent, this is unacceptable, we need to lift our game, and performance bounces back up above 50%. Sadly, PNG is the exception, you know, that sort of proves this rule. PNG is languishing at the bottom of the performance table. It does show some slight improvement over the years, but still well below 50%. And I guess that does just highlight what a difficult environment Papua New Guinea presents for the Australian aid program. And, you know, let's, you know, it's not to pick on PNG, but it is our closest neighbour and the largest recipient of Australian aid. So it's certainly significant. It's somewhat, it also gives a perspective on the shift away from Indonesia, which is up here. So, you know, it's actually got 100% at the moment, 100% score for program objectives on track. So it's taking funding from what is one of our best performing aid programs to what is our worst performing aid program. Just want to say a word on transparency, since it's a subject that we often write about. There's clearly been a deterioration in transparency at the project level over the last few years, and this has both been shown by the 2 audits that we've done and by the perception, or is confirmed by the perception of stakeholders in the 2 stakeholder surveys that we've undertaken. And it's, you know, also consistent with, and it was good to see the DAC review, the OECD review of Australian aid, come up with transparency as their number one recommendation, their first recommendation, that DFAT should improve its transparency in relation to the timely and accessible publication of activity level information. And I mention this because this new performance report signals that the government will be coming up with a new set of performance indicators. Right? Those 10 have been achieved or largely achieved, so it's seen as time to refresh them. That's a process that's underway, so I encourage everyone to get involved in that process. But I think a litmus test for the credibility of that process will be whether there is one of the 10 new benchmarks is for transparency at the project level. And then finally on performance, just one of the numbers we crunched, thought was interesting, was this the admin ratio, or the sort of the running costs of the aid program. They're at just around 7%, and they seem rather high by historical standards, especially given all the talk of, we don't have the skills and we're contracting everything out to facilities. Unclear why the admin ratio is at that level. Just briefly, the government announced a 5% cap, but sort of abandoned that almost immediately. Anyway, I just flagged this as something worthy of more research. Well, that's all about government policy. I think we should say a word about Labor. So enough of the blue, time for some red. What's Labor been saying on aid and these various issues? Prior to the last election, Labor committed an additional 800 million over the forward estimates, or 200 million a year, so about 5% as an increase. This year, so far, they've made a much weaker commitment, which is simply to provide more ODA than the coalition. But, that could be a token amount. It may be that a more concrete announcement will come closer to the election, but so far, it's still very vague, and indeed, you can, not as clear as it was in the run-up to the last election. In terms of position of Labor on aid policy, many of you would have heard Penny Wong speak at the Australasian Aid and International Development Conference. She made several points, I thought. One, basically signalling she would abolish the innovation exchange. She said she was unconvinced by it, that it operated in relative isolation. Second, she would reform the health security initiative while she supported it. She said it was bureaucratic and disconnected, and I think it can certainly be better structured, as we said, outside of DFAT. And then she spoke generally on the need for DFAT reform, highlighting structural inadequacies, management failings, growing dependence on management contractors, expertise and skills in decline. So certainly, I think a lot more on aid policy from Labor so far than on aid quantity. Okay, now we want to go, as I said, beyond the official aid program and look at, who's delivering Australian aid, the delivery partners. So this is the graph that summarises it. This data, is very hard to get on a comparable basis, and we've tried different ways. This is sort of the latest, just for 4 years, and using the categories of multilateral, commercial, or contractors, NGOs, universities, and developing countries. There are some other categories that are harder to interpret. And I want to talk about the first three, which are the biggest. But I'll just note, you do see this decline here, very sharp decline in developing country recipient executed projects, which reflects a move away from budget support. Okay, but I'm going to focus on the first three, which are the biggest. And I'm going to start with non-government organisations, and I do that because we've just done, Terence Wood, one of our researchers, has just helped ACFID write their State of the Sector report, which is a new report now available on their website. I think it gets the award for having the most boring cover, which is. The website's coming. Which is why I put Terence's photo up there just to make the slide look better. Anyway, I'm not going to summarise that report. It has a wealth of information in it. I commend it to you. I'm just going to highlight a few things that come out from it combined with some of the other research we've been doing. If we look at NGO funding, it's a pretty positive picture overall, and you certainly don't see any scale down. This is in constant dollars, so adjusted for inflation. And, 2001 is 400 million. Today, it's 1.8 billion, right? That's almost half the size of the official aid program. Of course, there's some overlap. That's, a relatively small amount comes from the official aid program. But, it's a massive and rapidly growing sector. This is non-DFAT other. So this is the use of Australian NGOs by other international NGOs or by other governments or other UN agencies, and it'd be interesting to find out more about this. It itself is growing rapidly. DFAT funding is less positive, and in fact has seen that decline. That comes from the first graph. Although this data which comes from DFAT shows more of a decline than this data that comes from the NGOs, right? Here's a smaller decline, and that may reflect that some of the cuts that DFAT reports is because DFAT's giving it to the contractors, right? But then the contractors are then handing it on to the NGOs. So the NGOs are reporting it as from DFAT, whereas from DFAT it's actually going to the contractors. So this may exaggerate the cuts in funding to NGOs. There's still been a reduction, but it may be smaller, as suggested by this graph. The biggest source of funding for the NGOs is from the public, and this is the picture for public donations, and I think you can look at this in a positive or negative light, depending on your mood. In a positive light, if you adjust for inflation, again, a massive increase from 200 million at the start of the millennium, or 200, maybe just less than 300, up to $1 billion, so that's tripling. The less positive spin, sorry, that's not inflation. Inflation adjusted is 400 to $1 billion, right, over the last 15 years. I guess the less negative spin is on the more recent past, right? We saw a big spike with the Asian tsunami, and those donors were, some of them were lost, but they were retained, others were retained or recaptured. But the growth has certainly slowed down in recent years and now seems to fluctuate depending on, whether there's a large humanitarian appeal or not. If we look at it, using the same sort of metrics we do for official aid as a percentage of GNI or per capita, again, for the decade as a whole, a significant increase, but for the last 4 or 5 years, flatlining, and it's about 40%, $40 a person is the average NGO donation. So I'd say for the more recent period, public generosity is steady rather than growing. One concern we've had is that NGOs have been cannibalising each other's donations and resulting in a kind of an arms race and increasing spend on fundraising without an increasing return. But if we combined what Terence has done with some earlier work we did, they're not quite comparable, but the suggestion is the fundraising ratios have stabilised rather than increased. So I think that's a good sign. And if we go down to the individual level, who are the big NGOs? World Vision still dominates, right? This is truncated, right? If we had World Vision, we have to go up to 348. Everyone else would seem rather small, so I've truncated the graph. But there are some interesting other members of the top 20, MSF and Compassion, neither of them members of ACFID. Fred Hollows, I'll show you soon, growing rapidly. And then MAA, which I had to look up, which is Muslim Aid Australia, which has propelled itself into the top 20. And there's another, I think it's Islamic Relief, I think, which is just outside the top 20. So we're certainly seeing some new entrants. You'll also notice the 2 UN agencies, UNHCR and UNICEF, that have been both very successful in fundraising. It is a very competitive environment and one with a lot of churn. So just to give you that perspective, this figure only looks at the top 10. And in fact, there are 9 because World Vision is 1, right, or 100%. So these are ratios to World Vision, both now, or the most recent, 2016, and then the earliest data we've got is 2003. So the first thing you can see is that the other agencies are catching up to World Vision, right, where World Vision still dominates. Back in 2003, the second largest NGO, which then was Oxfam, was little more than 10% of World Vision's size, right? Whereas now you've got 4 NGOs that are 10% or more of World Vision's size, and the largest, MSF, is now a quarter, right? So World Vision dominates, but other NGOs are catching up. And then you could just see some of the very differential growth. So you can see how MSF has sort of come from nowhere. Fred Hollows, likewise, has come from nowhere. The ones that don't have any red weren't in the top 10, right? So again, Australia's for UNHCR have come from nowhere, as has Global Development Group, which is another church-based NGO. So yeah, it's a very dynamic and competitive environment at the NGO level. Finally, just for those of you who aren't in the sector but might be interested in what's going on, you know, we had an interesting session at the Australasian Aid Conference, which is actually now available as a podcast, which certainly drew my attention to this debate. Oh, thank you. There's not much more to go. To this push by government, actually, to institute a joint fundraising mechanism. Australia used to have something called IDEC, which is the IDEC is the International Development Emergency Committee, which used to run joint appeals back in the days of Live Aid. It didn't last, and really what the push from government now is to reinstitute something like IDEC. As far as I can tell, the government's motivation, it sees it as a way to reduce fragmentation on the ground. If the aid agencies are forced to collaborate for fundraising, they'll have less of an incentive to get their own people on the ground for their own fundraising efforts. The NGOs, as far as I can tell, don't seem very keen on the idea. As I said, it is a very competitive environment, but of course the government has a lot of leverage, being a major funder of humanitarian aid. So it will be interesting to see how this debate plays out. All right, moving on from NGOs to contractors. I don't have as much information, but we'll start with the basic data from DFAT. Here's DFAT funding of contractors. This is just in nominal terms, but you know, you can see it has increased over the last few years, right? No sign, you know, you wouldn't know that the aid program was cut by $1 billion over these couple of years if you just looked at how the contractors were doing. So no doubt there has been more emphasis on funding through, to and through contractors. Going down to the individual level, it's harder to get that information, but you can get some. There was a useful answer to a Senate estimates question on who are the largest contractors, and this was the information provided for 2015-16. As I understand, this is sort of money expended in that year by these contractors. And, you know, you can see it's a very concentrated market. If you take the top 3, it's 50%. And if you take the top 6, I think you're up above 60%. And you take, these are the top 9, I think, you're up to 97%. So it's a very concentrated market. It has been disrupted by APT. There's a website called Love Me Tender, which scrapes all government tender documentation onto one website, and you can download that and sort by whatever category you want. So this is in terms of contract award, right? So this is not flow of money. This is how successful we've been in that year. And you can see in 2016-17, APT was very successful in winning a number of large contracts, and so it is sort of the emerging player. We hope, you know, to do a lot more analysis using this database and to be able to report it to you later. But just to compare the contractors and the NGOs, the contractor community is much more concentrated, even if you just focus on DFAT funding for the NGOs. As I mentioned, top 3 over 50%, whereas the top 3 for the NGOs only 30%. And then finally, yeah, for those of you who aren't contractors may not know, there has been this interesting move. I mean, ACFID has always been much stronger than what was the IDC, which was the contractor body, but the IDC has now been replaced by the IDCC, which is the International Development Contractors Community, and which was launched at the start of this year, and as I understand is meant to be better resourced, actually have paid staff and a more active voice in the development community. So I think that's a very welcome development. And then finally, multilaterals. I think this is the sort of real news. I think we've sort of been very focused on the share of the contractors versus the NGOs, that kind of battle, as it were, jostling for funding, but really not paying any attention to what is the biggest recipient of Australian aid, which is the multilateral system, you know, twice as big as the contractors. So if we're looking at contractors, we're seeing 800 million but we're looking at multilaterals, 1.6 billion, right? It's a much bigger share, and again, it's slightly volatile, but you don't see any cut. You wouldn't think this was an aid program that was in sharp decline. So what's going on here? Well, core funding to multilaterals is on the rise, and you know, this is very surprising. This is actually was brought out by the DAC review. You know, it's always been said Australia is not a big believer in core funding. The multilaterals focus on Africa, we focus on the Asia Pacific. Why would we give core funding to the multilaterals? And then in any case, the average figure, which I show here, is biased upwards because all the European countries give to the EU. You know, and you can see this was true for this period. We were, most of the period, we have been below the average, but somehow we've hit it now. Now this is slightly inflated because of those AIB payments. But even so, the trend goes well beyond that. And you can actually break down that, the core funding into, well, you can go right down to the agency level, but just if you look at three different types, the international development banks, the UN agencies, and other being like Global Fund, Gavi, Global Partnership on Education, all of them show an increase over the last decade. This is a 5-year average, moving average, because these are very volatile numbers, but you know, there is an underlying trend there, and I think it's particularly surprising to see the UN doing so well. You know, we can understand the pickup here to do with the UN Security Council bid and Labor, but it's certainly continued under the coalition government. So I think it'd be interesting to talk about why this is, it's certainly there. It's somewhat offset by reductions in earmarked contributions. This has been traditionally the way we've given support to the system. If you look at 2011, right, the earmarked contributions exceed the core contributions because that's exactly the argument, right? We want to get these agencies to work in our region, so we give them specific funding. But I guess what's happened, you know, a lot of that happened in Asia. You know, we've cut aid to Asia, so we've cut earmarked contributions to the multilaterals at the same time as increasing our core contributions for perhaps a range of different reasons. But the net effect is that multilateral funding is stronger than ever, which is probably an unexpected outcome. Okay, well this is the final section. I wanted to just say, to round it off, you know, go back to the international context. I'm not going to go through every donor. I'm just going to focus on the big three plus one. So the big three are now the US, the UK and Germany. There were 5 with France and Japan, but as you can see from this graph, France and Japan have somewhat fallen away, partly as a result of you know, their own changing economic priorities and difficulties, but also because these are you know, very much loan-based donors, and so they're getting a lot of inflows, reflows, right, that push down their net ODA, which is what's reported here. The US is still by far the biggest, but you can see the gap's closing. It doesn't dominate as it used to. Let's start with the US. You know, I think we were all concerned with the impact that Trump would have, and he certainly had a very negative impact with the global gag rule, which prevents agencies from receiving funding for family planning and also receiving US aid funding. But beyond that very regressive step, impact has not been negative, and in fact now looks somewhat positive. Trump administration proposed cuts of about 1/3 both last year and again for this year, but it was simply ignored last year by Congress that actually sets the aid budget, and it looks like it will be ignored again this year. So we're not seeing those savage cuts that we thought would come to fruition. And in terms of what we are seeing, there's a lot of emphasis in the Trump aid administration on what is called journeys to self-reliance, so graduation. So that's a narrative that may play out in our region on East Asia. It's now referred to as Outcome 1, and there are metrics to measure countries' progress to graduation, so they're used to get countries off aid. You know, whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure. But in terms of, you know, probably good things, the last two, Trump is now proposing a strengthened OPIC, which is a pre-existing small development finance institution, to be made much bigger. So I think that's, you know, a positive step, something that's been advocated for in Australia. and brings together a kind of concern for development with a belief in the private sector. So something that a good development to come out of a Republican administration. And then interestingly, the World Bank has just agreed on a big capital expansion, and that could have been vetoed by the US, and it was thought that it would be vetoed, but in the end, the Trump administration have signed off on this capital replenishment for the World Bank, I guess driven by concerns around China as a strategic rival, and so therefore a need to bolster the World Bank. That's the US, UK and Germany. We pay a lot of attention to the UK and how it went up to 0.7 and it stayed at 0.7, but I think we probably haven't really noticed that Germany has sort of snuck up there unannounced and is pretty much at the 0.7 mark now, and then so being a bigger economy is actually a larger donor than the UK. For Germany, the in-country refugee costs are a significant part of that, so probably not going to stay at 0.7. In 2016, it was 1/4 of its budget went to in-country refugee costs. But it's not only that, right? If you look at the yellow, you also see a significant increase, right? So excluding in-country refugee costs. And you've seen a big push in Germany as chair of the G20 in terms of advocating a Marshall Plan in Africa or a compact for Africa. And just on Africa, that does remind me, I was going to comment on the multilateral funding, that big increase in multilateral funding for everyone who thinks that Australia should be doing more on Africa. You should be very welcoming of this increase in core funding because their focus is Africa. Yeah, that's Germany. And then finally, UK. I think UK is a case of like, be careful what you wish for. UK is where what we would have looked like if we did ever get to 0.5 or anything like it. I'm sure its aid program is still doing a lot of good, but it's a very troubled, divisive aid program. There's a very good article on it, which is hyperlinked here. There are constant campaigns being run against the aid program, such as this Daily Mail campaign that charity begins at home. That is begins and ends at home. And Department for International Development is also, no longer the glorious institution it once was and is having to fight for funds. You see a big increase away from funding through DFAT. Its share of the aid program has fallen from 87 to 74%, whereas the other government departments have gone from 11 to 18. So in a constrained fiscal environment, a large aid program becomes very attractive. So those are the three I was going to focus on, but as some of you will know, last night there was a big announcement coming out of New Zealand that I just couldn't, that's also important. New Zealand's announced, although it's not their budget, but just ahead of their budget, they've announced a large increase of 180 million a year for the next 4 years. It's not clear exactly where it's going to go, but a range of things are mentioned: the Pacific, multilaterals, climate change, humanitarian. And New Zealand's also been pretty poor performer when it comes to aid generosity, but they put themselves on an upward trajectory and with some very ambitious goals. So interesting to see how that plays out, if that has any influence here. All right, well, that's the end of my presentation. I do want to point you to the aid tracker if you want to find out more. A lot of these numbers are up there. It's already been updated. And I do want to say that, I presented this myself, but I've drawn on the work of a lot of colleagues, and I'd like to thank all of them for their contributions to this analysis. So thank you, and happy to take questions or comments. Yeah, John.
Question: Do you include the World Bank with the UN?
No. So the World Bank is here with the IDBs, so the International Development Banks. Yeah.
So can you briefly say where the increases have been for the UN?
Like specific agencies?
Yes.
No, but I can give you the spreadsheet, and you can have a look. But yeah, it's all there on the OECD DAC. I'd be very happy to share that with you, John, and we can try and dig into it. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan from Lowy. Just back to the point about public support for aid. It was disappointing that the Minister used Lowy polling in isolation. There's been plenty of other polling about Australian perceptions on aid, including from the Institute. In 2011, we asked the question of how much you think the Australian budget spends on aid, and we again asked that question this year, and the answer is quite deafening. It's the average Australian thinks that 16% of the federal budget goes towards the aid program, and when asked how much they think should be, they think it's 10%. So, so when you talk about that the majority of Australians want to cut the aid program, it's a very different picture from thinking it's 14% going down to 10%, as opposed to where it really is under 1% of federal expenditure. I mean, I'm not sure any Australian could really identify, or me, myself included, pinpoint the exact breakdown of federal government expenditure, but I think it was disappointing for her to pick that statistic in isolation, and it shows that public support is just a really poor excuse for a lack of leadership on this issue.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it was interesting. I mean, the government didn't actually give a reason for this latest aid cut, right, the latest freeze. So in the past, first of all, we had the debt and deficit, then we had the unable to get the measures, budget-saving measures through the Senate, right? That was the 2015 cuts. Then last year, we needed the money for, I think it was for a spy agency. Whereas this year, they didn't even give a reason for cutting in the new year, the forward estimates. So, yeah, there's certainly no coherent policy, I think, on aid quantities. And it just seems to be taken for granted that you can just cut it again and again and not really think seriously about a reason for it.
Thank you very much. Can you make any comments about the Australian government's approach to volunteers? There's been a continuing program there. Is there any news on that?
Right. I'd have to look in the book. There was the government made a big, at the lockup, there was a big emphasis on there's a new community grants program, which is going to bring in smaller community groups, not-for-profits, into the aid program, and there's a lot of detail on that in the budget document. I think that it's a small program. It's about 10 million for fairly small grants of about 30,000. But that's not volunteers. It will be in this book, which I would have to look at. So,
page 110.
Yeah. It wasn't highlighted, so I'm guessing it's not changed from previous years.
Hello, Mark Rice from Results Australia. On the topic which has been debated in the last few weeks about government leading versus following public opinion, the introductory section of the aid budget paper does have an overview and I think an attempt to explain and sell aid to the Australian public. Would you see that as being a first attempt to try to build extra support for either among the public or maybe even among the government?
Yeah, it's certainly true. This is the Orange Book, and for a government that didn't really have a budget in the first year or two, it's quite heavy, and it's up to 134 pages. And you're right, the first few pages are a sort of aid narrative. And that aid narrative is pretty much around how it's in our interests to have a growing and prosperous region. Whether that's going to sway public opinion, I doubt it. Yeah, I think it's hard for the government to make the case to the Australian public for aid when it is cutting the aid program, right? And it's one thing to have cut it and said, well, we had a difficult situation, we've cut it, but now we committed to it. We're not going to cut it anymore. But when you continue to cut it, I think what makes sense politically is just to keep quiet. Yeah, so I think until the government stops cutting aid, it's not really going to be able to make the case convincingly for aid.
One here.
Stephen, thank you very much for all the analysis that you and your colleagues have done. Two questions about effectiveness. The government's 10 performance benchmarks, which you mentioned. First, how well do they relate or correspond to what you and your colleagues would regard as the best measures of effectiveness or beneficial impact? And secondly, have you seen any sign that they are used year on year to determine the allocation of the government's aid?
Yeah, good questions. I think the system in place is pretty good and has been quite stable. So that's been, one of the ways in which integration has been well managed. I think that basically it's taken the performance system that was established over the last decade in AusAid and brought it to DFAT. Perhaps it was a bit over complex, simplified it somewhat, but has basically maintained it and has produced these reports on a regular basis. You might remember with AusAid sometimes the reports were long delayed because they were seen as politically sensitive, whereas now, they bring out this performance report every year before the budget. So I think that's a kind of good sign of discipline. And it's, it's both at the project level and at the country level. So you're trying to capture both those two important levels. And it's sort of scrutinised by the Office of Development Effectiveness, which, while not independent totally, has some degree of autonomy and so does give a second opinion and has that independent evaluation committee sitting over it. And also has a sort of fairly, an in-depth program of evaluation. And one thing that, we talked about last year, but didn't mention this year, ODE, or the department, through ODE's work, the department introduced a new evaluation policy, which replaced a sort of mandatory approach. You must evaluate these projects over a certain amount, which inevitably wasn't complied with a more realistic voluntary approach, that you should evaluate like at least 2 or 3 programs a year. Putting the onus back on the country managers to choose which evaluations they'll do. But at the same time, then once they've committed to those evaluations, you put out a plan, these are the evaluations we will do. And ODE's now, come back and said they basically have followed through on that, and all those evaluations, there were a few changes, but more or less what was promised in terms of evaluations was delivered, and it's all been published, which isn't normally the case. So yeah, I would say overall is a pretty strong performance system, but is it used? That was the second part of your question. And I guess I was trying to say with that example of Indonesia and PNG, no, right? If you were doing performance-based allocations, which is what the government initially promised it would do, then you would increase aid to Indonesia and reduce aid to PNG. Of course, the world is much more complex than that, and you can understand why that's not happening, but you have to be honest on whether. So I'd say at the macro level, my own take is that there's not a lot of influence of performance on macro allocations. It's not like infrastructure is going up because those are the really good projects, right? Infrastructure is going up because that's the government's priority. At the individual project level, is performance having more of an impact? I'm not sure. I'm not, immersed enough. There have been some positive developments. Recently there's a new governance aid board, which has an external member and is a more rigorous screening mechanism for aid projects coming into the pipeline. And aid projects have to be signed off now, not only, I understand, by the High Commissioner, but also by their counterpart here in Canberra. So I think DFAT's trying to respond to those criticisms, that it's not giving enough attention to performance at the individual project level. Perhaps it's too early to tell whether that's having an effect. Yeah. Daniel?
Stephen? Thank you. Question tagging on to the issue of evaluation. Is there any quantification or measure as to how much worse off recipients are as a result of decreased foreign aid expenditure?
Right. No. No, I think, like in general, you'd say they've, aid is just too small. If you look at Indonesia, try and quantify how much Indonesia's lost. You can talk about some individual projects that have been, seem to be really good and weren't extended. But it would be sort of heroic, I think, to try to quantify the macro cuts of those aid, the macro costs of those aid cuts. Yeah.
Stephen, 2 questions just about the SDGs and transparency. So the first, Australia signed the SDGs in 2015. The OECD DAC peer review said that the government should work similar to other donors and align their program more to SDGs programmatically. The budget document doesn't have anything about the SDGs except an appendices which shows the logos. What would the utility be of giving greater alignment to SDGs and indicators? That's my first question. Is there any utility? My second is around transparency. So you've mentioned that the deep sea cable, it's hard because they're hiding under commercial in confidence at the moment. The scoping study that was announced through a limited tender in December very quickly went to a company called Vocus, who were a donor to the Liberal Party in 2015-16. What sort of issues do these commercial in confidence types of lack of transparency raise for the aid program?
Well, I mean, others also feel free to add in. I'm not an expert on all these issues. But on the SDGs, you're right. They appear as an appendix. It seems rather tokenistic. At the same time, it would be very hard to frame an aid program in line with the SDGs, right? The SDGs cover everything. And there are 17 of them. And do you really want to have 17 sort of headings in your aid program? Is it a coherent way to think about the way you give development assistance? Likewise, the MDGs weren't really ever used as a frame for the aid program. I think they're more a communication device and a framework for reporting on performance rather than a planning mechanism. So I know the SDGs are popular in some parts of the aid community, but I would caution against advocating for their use as a planning framework. I mean, they just don't add value at the planning level. To be a planning framework, you've got to have some priorities, and the SDGs don't prioritise. And on transparency and this limited tender, I mean, it's quite transparent that this company won the tender and that they're a donor to the Liberal Party, so it doesn't seem to be that's a transparency issue. I guess that's a value for money issue, and I'm sure they're in a hurry to do this program, and so that's probably why they didn't go through the tender process. And whether this company was the best, I mean, I've got no reason to think it wasn't the best. I'm just don't have any information at all. In terms of not giving the cost for this tender, I mean, you'd think they would know enough to give an upper bound on the cost. So I'm not, and obviously the newspaper, there is this figure of 200 million floating around. So yeah, it wasn't very convincing not to see any costing for this for this submarine cable. And also, yeah, I think where they could have done more on transparency was talk more about these issues around implementation, co-financing, how much is going to be co-financed, and governance arrangements. And yeah, you do worry about this, that it's normally better to negotiate a project and then agree on it rather than agree on it and then negotiate. And this seems to be a case where, it's been an announceable, so it's already been agreed, and now you've got to do the hard work of trying to negotiate co-funding arrangements and good governance.
Sai Abraham, my question is on aid to Africa. It's almost unbelievable that Australia provides about 120 million per year for all of sub-Saharan Africa. And I think currently even the bilateral aid is even much worse, which is about 31 million out of the 120 million. I just can't understand this because I think in many ways Africa is in great need, and it's on the west side of Australia. And yet, now there is not at all any focus on Africa, or even it's as if it doesn't exist. So yeah, but I'm just wondering, whether the China factor could actually maybe in many ways help. So have you got some insights on how we could move forward? Because certainly there is a lot of NGO support, and most of the money from NGOs is spent on Africa. But why is the government, going this way? So I'm just wondering if you could give us some insights.
Yeah, so I wanted to show you this, emphasize this slide for all people who think there should be more aid to Africa. This is core funding for multilaterals, right? And so it is at a record high level, right? In fact, it's 30% of the aid program, 30%, right? And okay, that's slightly biased by this AIIB, but if you take that out, I think you're looking at
above 20% or 25%. And as I showed here, right, it's on an upward trajectory for all types of multilaterals. And for these multilaterals, their main focus for their core funding is Africa. I would say IDA is more than 50% Africa. And if you think about the Global Fund and Gavi, Australia is, we're fighting to keep them in Asia, right? Their focus is so strongly on Africa. I'm sure Global Fund and Gavi would be more than 50% Africa. So yeah, there are two ways to support Africa. One is to set up our own bilateral programs and be yet another bilateral donor in a crowded donor environment. And the second way is to support organisations that are already focused on Africa and give them more funding, right? And actually, although, I'm not sure if it's actually a policy and if this is the reason, but that's actually what the government's been doing, right, is boosting it significantly, core contributions to multilateral agencies who are focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah. So I think this does change the way, or should change the way we think about Australia's aid and its, there have been the very sharp bilateral cuts to the Africa program, but there have also been these compensating increases.
But Stephen, just maybe to follow up on that comment, it presumes that that's a policy decision to counterbalance the bilateral allocations with the multilateral. I mean, it would be interesting to know if DFAT in their participation through, you talked about influence. Core contributions give you influence in the international sector, so that could be a driver of why DFAT is trying to balance declining influence by shoring up its core contributions. But if it is using that influence to try and influence aid allocations away from Africa towards the region and towards the Pacific, then that argument doesn't hold. In fact, they're trying to reduce that. I mean, I just don't think we know enough about the rationale for that decision, but it's a really good question to ask and maybe engage with DFAT on.
That's right. And we have to do more. We have to do more work. But if my hunch would be why we see this. If we look at the IDBs, there is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank factor, but then also high levels of support for IDA, and that is the support for this rules-based system and sort of counterbalancing China. If we look at the other, that's a Global Fund and Gavi that have very strong domestic lobbies, and the government didn't want to take them on, so they protected their allocations. And then we look at the UN, and that's a surprise, but maybe that's to do with the Security Council bid and then the Human Rights Council bid, and as you said again, wanting to be an international player. So they may be the reasons, and yeah, the effect at the margin may be some increase of those, greater attention by those agencies on our region, but they are, even if Australia has some marginal influence, right, they're going to remain overwhelmingly focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So we are still indirectly channeling funds to Africa.
A very quick point of clarification from last night. I thought I heard DFAT say that Australia was now the 12th largest donor on the OECD rankings, and then here you said the 19th, and I was wondering, that's about most generous, or is it a different number, or was there a conflation, or if you could clarify?
No, I guess, yeah, I could have shown those numbers, but I wanted to keep the slides to under 100. But yeah, you're right, because we are one of the biggest economies, then you put our prosperity and our generosity together. Yeah, we were 13th, but with this AIIB boost, we are now 12th. So yeah, if you want to, make it sound like we're, still a pretty good donor, then you'll use that number, right? That we're 12th. But I think the standard international metric for comparison is this generosity index, and that's where we're 19th, and that's the one I've focused on here. But they're actually consistent. Yeah.
Sorry, just to build on the discussion about aid to Africa, another lens to look through, and I take your point about the aid effectiveness and perhaps the utility of going through to multilaterals and their prioritisation. But given the white paper, Australia can't be said to be leveraging our relationships in any way with African countries because of the effective demise of bilateral programming. If you've got a 300,000 person diaspora, African-born diaspora in Australia, you've got $40 billion worth of foreign direct investment. We're not utilising that, so there is a political imperative around aid as well, and it's basically not realised in our relationships with Africa currently. And I think this goes to a sort of a second issue around aid communications, that there's no centre to it. So it's either through announceables in the Minister's office, or it's dispersed through DFAT. So there actually is no grander narrative. So despite the white paper narrative, we're not actually telling the story about what the Australian Aid Program is achieving in any coherent or effective way, which then underscores the point perhaps the Minister, Connie, is trying to make, that Australians don't, there's not a support there. Well, that's because the government is not leading and is not communicating.
I think one of the things Terence does in his report is look at where NGOs give aid, and Africa is the main region. Right? So it's very different to the official aid program.
Stephen, thanks so much for this morning. Just a quick question. I think you had a slide there about the big three. Out of interest, was China there anywhere? Are we able to? Right. Do we have any sense of their level of investment, etc.?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. Again, I just ran out of time. I thought I've got to stop somewhere, But obviously China is the emerging donor. And when you look at China as a donor, if you try and apply the DAC criteria, they're still not that big, right? They're about the size of Australia as a donor. But of course they bring in this, they're like a massive development finance institution, right? They bring in all this additional development financing that doesn't strictly count as aid, but which is certainly seen by countries as coming from China and valued by them, and on those indicators, it's leaves everyone else behind, I think, at this stage. The interesting news from China is they've set up this new development aid agency, right, which they haven't had before, and someone wrote a blog for us just recently on that aid agency and what its issues will be. So if you're interested in that, check out our blog. But yeah, there's a lot more that needs to be said. In fact, one interesting thing I was told is CGD has this Global Commitment to Development Index, right, where they rank every country by their commitment to development using their aid effort, but also other indicators like trade and migration policies. And that's just for OECD, but they're now redoing that to try to include China. And that's a big exercise, because how do you measure China's commitment to an impact on development of other countries?
Sorry for coming back again. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in my view, the small amount of aid that's allocated to Africa, I can't actually see it advancing Australian economic and trade relationship with Africa. At the moment, Africa's growth is increasing. China has about 188 billion trade with Africa. So I think it just doesn't make sense to me, that there is a huge economic potential almost next door to Australia, and Australia is keeping a blind eye. So I just can't see, why Australia is not actually advancing its own interests in Africa at the moment.
I'll take that as a comment.
You had up one of your graphs there before. There was only about 3 big contracting organisations had the biggest share of the pie. That implies to me there's not proper competition there. Is the AusAid tender process and all that giving a fair go to the small contractors? It doesn't seem to be. Are they really getting competitive results with only 3? But just on the face, it seems to be not correct.
Yeah, I can't really represent DFAT. So this is just some analysis that we've done. I guess, it's meant to raise those kind of questions. Yeah, Jackie.
As a contractor, maybe I can comment. I don't think the tender process as so much has changed, but the way in which they're doing procurement has changed. So fewer, bigger, longer projects, and I think that they are much easier. You have to have really big balance sheets and be a big company to bid for them effectively. So I think it's the restructuring of a lot of the way they're doing the tenders innately preferences the larger tendering organisations. It's not how they apply value for money or conduct the tendering, it's how they structure the bids themselves.
Thank
I can probably also add something. We're a smaller contractor. who are trying to get in on this market, and we've had some issues with, you know, things that I guess if we were in the UK, they would come back and ask us for clarification around things, but they're being very good at talking with us about how we can potentially not make really basic mistakes, because some stuff's really, yeah, I don't know, you know, like the advisor remuneration framework, there's very specific things, economic benefit to Australia, things that are very niche to the Australian aid landscape that don't happen in other places. But I would say that DFAT's very conscious of that, and they're very good at speaking with us and learning from that, and I think trying to make it fairer. So I do feel like there's a definite, what's the word, viewpoint on their side that this is an issue, and that they're looking at it, I think, and I'm someone who loses out from this stuff. But yeah, it seems like it's not going to last like that, and it's going to, get better.
Thanks, Stephen. Just two interesting slides for me from the Papua New Guinea perspective is this one, and then the one that shows how poor the aid effectiveness is. And of these, the bigger companies there, I wonder what percentage of those are in Papua New Guinea. So ABT, for example, I think most of that would be in Papua New Guinea. So I'm not implying that it's these big contractors causing aid ineffectiveness. It's probably the other way around, that the governments... that it's to try and fix this aid ineffectiveness, they're throwing all of the aid under some of these big companies and big contractors. And I mean, it's sort of I don't think it's controversial to say that that we might see a lower aid effectiveness next year in Papua New Guinea with everything under one, which is no disrespect to the good people working there, but it doesn't seem like a very sustainable model.
Yeah, I mean, they do also monitor aid performance at the project level, and those numbers are much higher and show much less variation. I mean, there is some variation. I haven't, got the numbers with me, but as I recall, there is a slight reduction in project level effectiveness in PNG in particular compared to other countries, but it's nothing like the gap you see here. And, I think PNG is a very difficult place to operate in, as are some of the other Pacific Island economies, and I'm a bit sceptical of some of the other ratings. But yeah, it's, I put it this way: there's no obvious solution, right, to improve the effectiveness of our aid in PNG. We've been trying for a long time. All right. Well, I'm pretty conscious that. Yes, please.
One very last question. Sorry, on the question of the admin costs that DFAT is bearing. I mean, would you say that is also because of the increasing use of managing contractors, or was the 5% cap just never really realistic? And no matter whether they have the in-house capacity and manage it that way, or the managing contractors, you'll still need to have a higher admin cost?
Yeah, so the use of contractors and facilities should reduce your admin costs, right? Because that's not charged to your... These are actually called departmental costs. These are like the running costs. So the contractors, even though they're supplying that administrative service, they're all charged to the aid program. Right, so the use of contractors should bring down this ratio. The 5% cap, was announced, I think it was about the first budget, or maybe the second budget. I think it was the first. And it was meant to be, we've integrated, and now we're going to get all these efficiencies. And so it was kind of a signal from Julie Bishop, that this is going to be different from the AusAid waste. But yeah, then I think the next year there were the very steep aid cuts, and so it was abandoned straight away. Now, look, I'm not saying it's too high at 7%. It's a very imprecise measure of efficiency, and there may be differences in the way that DFAT count this compared to AusAid. But I guess this is one of a number of things that deserves more research. It is a puzzle. If we're always hearing that DFAT's short on staff and that it's contracting everything out. Why is the admin ratio so high? I think that's the question that is posed by this graph. All right, well, I'll just close proceedings. Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you found it useful, and come to our other events. Hey, good. Thanks, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Good.
Hey,
terrific.
Wendy. Yep.
No, not too many slides. It was fine.